This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome to this special edition of NC Spin. In just 13 weeks, we're going to hold an historic election, voting for president as well as U.S. Senate, congressional seats, our governor, judges, council of state, and legislators. On this week's show, we want to preview for you the candidates, the issues, and how things look 3 months out. So let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include Andrew Taylor, better known as Andy, professor of political science at NC State University, John Hood, syndicated columnist and author, Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, and Joe Stewart, the executive director of the NC FreeEnterprise Foundation. The polls, few will agree that this has been disagree that this has been the strangest run-up to an election that we've seen ever. We've had a contentious presidential primary, highly unusual North Carolina primary election process, and the controversial HB2 bathroom bill, which has overshadowed much of the news. So we want the panel to share their insights 3 months out. I'm going to ask each of you, polls have consistently shown that both nationally and in our state, the two presidential nominees have the highest negative ratings ever measured. How's this going to impact the turnout in North Carolina's election? Traditionally, about 65% of registered voters turn out to vote in presidential elections. What do you think is going to happen here, Andy?
Well, I think fear and loathing is often as much of a motivator as excitement. And obviously on both sides of the aisle, there's a tremendous amount of antipathy about the candidates. I think that will drive people out. It looks like we might well be a battleground state, so there's going to be a lot of spending here and a lot of GOTV activity. So I would say the interest is going to be pretty high and turnout as high as ever.
And the negatives aren't going to dampen the turnout?
No. They're going to drive it.
All right, John, what do you think?
Well, I'll add to that in North Carolina, though, of course, everybody in our state, just like everybody in the country, cares about who the president's going to be. I think that the political energy in North Carolina is more about the governor's race than it is about any other statewide race. That's because the Democrats, who historically had at least some power in Raleigh, are shut out. And they can't get the legislative majorities back, at least not immediately. The governor's race is something that's very competitive. They could win that race. That's why a lot of the energy, a lot of the money is from the Democratic side flowing into that governor's race,
so
and the Republicans are responding in kind.
You're predicting a high turnout?
I think a lot of interest in the governor's race.
Chris?
Yeah, I think there'll actually be high turnout as well, and I don't disagree that a lot of energy in North Carolina is around the governor's race. What I find interesting is how the candidates for governor are going to get some airtime when it really starts getting past Labor Day, and Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump both think this is a key state for their success and start spending a lot of money here. And I agree with Andy. I think this will be a higher turnout than usual just because it's such a polarizing year.
Joe, you track these numbers constantly. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there will be a significant amount of attention played on North Carolina, but the challenge is that without straight ticket voting, the actual voting process may take slightly longer. We may see the first few days of early voting delays, lengthier lines for people to vote. That may have some impact, but I think the attention on the state will definitely prompt a higher turnout.
All right, well, let's discuss the U.S. Senate and congressional races. Andy Taylor, Democrats desperately want to win that U.S. Senate race in our state, knowing that chances of retaking control of the Senate might hinge on this outcome. We've got two-term incumbent Senator Richard Burr running against Deborah Ross, who up until the primary has never been on a statewide ballot. The polls show this is a fairly close contest. Why is that the case?
Well, you mentioned in the earlier part of your question, Tom, that North Carolina is perhaps seen as pivotal. I would suggest that if Senator Burr loses, then the Senate is already Democratic. I think there are 5 or 6 other Republican defended Senate seats in places like Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, Ohio, Wisconsin, that they were more likely to go Democratic than the North Carolina seat. So it'd be really bad news for Republicans nationally and their control of the Senate if Senator Burr really looks like he's in trouble, is going to lose. You're right, it is surprising it's very close. Senator Burr has been in the Senate now for 12 years. He was in the House for a decade before that. He's chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. And yet, a lot of people don't know who he is. In a lot of the recent polls, there are about 30% of respondents who say they don't really have a view of him. You compare that to the governor, and only 10% say they don't have a view of Governor McCrory. So it is interesting, and that may be one of the reasons why this is closer than one would suspect.
But if 30% don't know who Senator Burr is, you'd have to believe fewer percent know who Deborah Ross is. She's not been on a statewide ballot before.
Yeah, absolutely. Perhaps it helps her a little that her House district was in Wake County in the Raleigh media market, so maybe that does boost her name ID a little bit. But in a fast-growing state like North Carolina, you'd be hard-pressed to find many people outside of the Raleigh market that could actually tell you who Deborah Ross is.
John, do you think there's a single issue on which this U.S. Senate race might turn?
Not really. Deborah Ross is doing the usual things the Democratic challengers to Republican senators do. She's describing Richard Burr as not friendly to people who need help from the federal government. She's obviously connecting him as much as possible to Donald Trump. Richard Burr, in turn, is connecting her as much as possible to Hillary Clinton. So it's a kind of a traditional race there. And I know Deborah Ross, and I mean no disrespect, but I don't think that she's in the same position that some of the other Democrats in other states are. She doesn't have the money. She isn't known statewide. And because before she was in the House, she was the head of the ACLU chapter in North Carolina, I think she is vulnerable to a lot of the usual things Republican Senate candidates do to Democratic opponents.
Well, I saw Deborah Ross not long ago, and to what John was saying, she says the money is coming in. She's getting big crowds wherever she goes.
I think the race is creeping up in terms of its importance. It's cracked some top 10 lists, top 8 lists. I don't know if it's good. I think the perception is as it stays close, I think more money will come into North Carolina. And remember, we were sitting here in 2008 saying Kay Hagan had never been on a statewide ballot before. She was a state senator. Nobody knew her in North Carolina. Nobody thought she had a chance against Elizabeth Dole.
Yeah, she got the Obama bump.
Well, and I think some people believe that Donald Trump will not do very well and will really fade if he keeps saying outrageous things. And I think there could be a bump. This is a very closely divided state. I think this will be very close.
On the money, though, Burr has a tremendous amount of money in hand, even though she's
$9 million
raising a little
in the
bit
bank.
more. And the other thing is, it's a double-edged sword with Trump for a lot of candidates down ballot, and that is, although he may be a drag, there's a lot of big Republican donors across the country who are not going to give very much to him, and who are trying to build a firewall, particularly in the Senate, and protect the Senate Republican majority.
Joe, you've been following these things for a long time, and we've asked the question on previous shows, but if you're Deborah Ross, are you going to appear with Hillary Clinton? Conversely, if you're Richard Burr, are you going to be appearing much with Donald Trump?
I think they will have to appear with their respective parties' nominees. It is such a competitive state that any little incremental difference can make a significant impact on the outcome. And I think both candidates are going to necessarily want to be a part of whatever the conversation is relative to the statewide race in president, governor, everything. They're all going to have to try to get every bit of attention they can.
We thank you for watching NC Spin on the air or on YouTube. Here's a reminder, there's much more on our website, ncspin.com, or NC Spin on Facebook. You'll find video footage not seen anywhere else, perspective pieces from our panel, and my weekly column. Get more balanced debate from the Old North State on ncspin.com, NC Spin on Facebook, or on Twitter at NC Spin Tweets. When we come back, we're going to talk about the congressional races and go right on down the ballot. Stay with us.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Baseball players from other countries are considered guest workers here. Baseball, the previous administration and Congress cut a deal in 2006 allowing foreign players to travel freely across the country. Not so for agriculture guest workers. They're vilified for doing work Americans won't, and they face a mountain of red tape just to get here. Shouldn't American agriculture get the same consideration as baseball? Farm Bureau and Agriculture, we keep North Carolina growing.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
We now return to NC Spin.
We continue our special edition NC Spin, in which we're giving you kind of a soup to nuts coverage of the November elections. We want to move into the congressional races. We've got 10 Republicans, 3 Democrats in Congress currently representing our delegation. Chris, you see that changing much?
I think it'd be very surprising. There might be, I guess, the 13th congressional district might be close, but this is when we talk about this on the show every year, the North Carolina is roughly evenly divided. Even in a big Republican year, you'd think they would have some majority, but this is just a testament to gerrymandering. These districts, even though they've been withdrawn, most of them are bulletproof. The only thing I would say, it would have to be a giant wave year for one party or the other, and maybe a couple of these would be very close. I don't think anybody's predicting a giant wave election yet.
All right. John, he says the 13th district might be interesting. Why?
Well, because it's the only open seat, and it was open because they redrew the maps. The new 13th district is quite different from the old one. And Ted Budd, who is the Republican nominee and likely the winner, is a political newcomer. I think all those things make it interesting, but I would be shocked if he didn't win. I understand it could be more competitive, in part because it's an open seat, but he still is favored.
Y'all agree with that?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It was very interesting in the primary that Ted Budd, John said, a newcomer, beat 5 state legislators, sitting state legislators, with 6,300 votes, 20%. In the primary, of course, it took place in June because of the redistricting. So he's been able to basically win a lottery within the Republican Party to perhaps become a member of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Well, okay, so let's go back to the 9th District Republican race. Robert Pittenger had a very close primary race there. I mean, he narrowly won over Mark Harris. Do we think that this is just going to be a laydown and he's going to roll all over Chris Cano?
Yes.
I think so, yeah. The way the district is drawn, I think it's very unlikely that Pittenger loses.
Any of the other races in any of the other districts that you feel like we ought to note?
Well, not really. As John said, there are all incumbents running again. And so that makes, we know the extent of incumbency advantage in the House of Representatives today.
Is there going to be any pushback in that 2nd district with George Holding won the primary?
Absolutely not.
None.
The one district, if there's a Democratic wave, that I would keep my eye on is the 8th district. Richard Hudson is the incumbent. It is different than it was before. Thomas Mills, who is a political consultant and blogger, is the Democratic nominee. It's not so much about Thomas, though I think he'll do fine. It's just that's the one district I could imagine in a heavily Democratic year might surprise us.
All right. Well, the governor and the council of state races will be elected November 8th, so we're going to ask our panel to handicap them. Joe Stewart, incumbent Governor Pat McCrory, faces a serious challenge from Attorney General Roy Cooper. Polls show this to be very close. Help us understand why.
Well, as the famous philosopher Jimmy Buffett said, changes in latitude, changes in attitude. We've seen a significant change in the demography of North Carolina. Half of the state now is non-native. 20% of the state's voters live in Wake and Mecklenburg County. We've just become more nationalized in our politics and our political orientations, and it makes our statewide races very competitive. The battlegrounds typically now are the suburbs. It's whichever voter can get those voters to turn out and vote for them that's going to win.
We're not exactly Margaritaville. All right, I'm sorry, bad pun. John, make the case for Pat McCrory's reelection.
Well, under McCrory's governorship, North Carolina has recovered from the economic recession faster and stronger than most other states in most measures. That is the traditional case for any incumbent governor is the economy of the state performing better under me than it would have under an alternative or is compared to other parts of the country. Now, will the voters reward him for that? Will they credit him for that? I don't know. But that's the case he's going to make, is that North Carolina is getting better. Let's keep our momentum going. Most governors in that situation in the past, they tend to be favored. However, the polls show a basically dead even race, and I do think it's either man's race to win.
All right. Chris, I'll ask you, make the case for Roy Cooper's election.
Well, I think, first of all, that North Carolina is benefiting from a national economic recovery. We've had, 70, 80 months in a row of national job growth. McCrory likes to talk about unemployment.
Although it's the slowest recovery we've had in some time.
Well, it's a record. It's a record number of months in a row where we've had job growth. Unemployment is way down in the country, just like it is in North Carolina. So part of the problem is going to be Trump's going to be here talking about how terrible things are. McCrory's going to say, "Oh no, everything's good here." Every governor says that. I think the big issue is going to be We spend less per capita on education in North Carolina than we did before the Great Recession. There's a perception that Governor McCrory is not standing up to the socially very hard right, far conservatives on things like HB2. I don't think HB2 will decide the election, but it might drive turnout in the urban areas where people are very upset about it. McCrory's not going to win those probably, but I think the question will be how many people will be really upset and vote. So he has not stood up to what people perceive as the radical right North Carolina General Assembly, and he said he would.
All right, well, let's chase that rabbit for a second. Andy, so far as it goes, if Roy Cooper wins, everybody is pretty well conceding the fact that we're still going to have a Republican-controlled legislature. Whether or not they have veto power is another thing. But you think that if Roy Cooper were to win, we'd be dealing with vetoes a lot during this next 2017 session?
It depends upon the size of the Republican majorities in both the House and Senate, which, as you noted earlier on, could be precarious if there is some down-ballot wind that helps Democratic legislative candidates. So yes, I do. And you know, Chris talks about the changing nature of the North Carolina Republican Party, but it's also true that the North Carolina Democratic Party is very different from when we last had a Democratic governor, and particularly from the days of Jim Hunt. And it will be interesting to see, you know, when the shoe's on the other foot, which it will be at some time, even if it's not Attorney General Cooper, what Republicans will be saying about this new Democratic Party and its ideological position.
Joe, let's look at the Lieutenant Governor's race, which is basically a rematch of 2012. Dan Forrest and Linda Coleman. Handicap that one for us.
Yeah, it's a tough race to be able to identify a separate identity for. I mean, most people don't necessarily know who the Lieutenant Governor is or what the office does. Forrest has done a great job of establishing himself in the role. He's proven to be a pretty solid fundraiser. He's ubiquitous around the state. I think Linda Coleman not having the full support in all likelihood of the State Employees Association, which she did 4 years ago, probably gives Forrest a little bit of a competitive advantage.
All right, after these messages, we're going to run down the rest of the Council of State races and more elections.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
You only get one pair of eyes. Keeping them healthy is critical to your quality of life. Members of the NC Optometric Society know this. These highly skilled doctors have the latest technology and the medical training to care for your eyes and the eyes of those you love. Make sure you visit your optometrist for an eye exam on a regular basis. For more information on keeping your eyes healthy or to find the right optometrist for you, visit nceyes.org. Remember, healthy eyes, healthier lives.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
We continue this special edition of NC Spin, in which we're talking about elections. We talked about the governor, lieutenant governor in the last segment. Let's move on down to some of the other Council of State races. One of those that is going to be very interesting November 8th is going to be the Attorney General's race, Joe. We've got Republican Buck Newton running against Josh Stein. This is an open seat. give us some viewpoint on perspective on that.
Yeah, I think this is a significant race and maybe in some ways more important than other statewide races. The Attorney General of North Carolina not typically been an activist, and I think Josh Stein certainly would bring a very different perspective to the role of Attorney General, maybe being more aggressive in his pursuit of certain elements of an agenda dealing with corporate malfeasance as he might perceive it. But we're going to see a lot of money from the outside Attorney General's organizations. The Republican and the Democratic groups will spend money here. But generally speaking, I don't think the name recognition is high, but Stein has a pretty competitive advantage in terms of his personal fundraising.
And the early polls, Andy, say this is pretty much a toss-up.
Yeah, like a lot of the other races are statewide. Will be interesting. Joe mentioned earlier on the fact that now we don't have straight ticket voting, whether that will have an effect. It's also an important race as well. If you think about the recent history of North Carolina, it seems to be a sort of staging post for people with gubernatorial ambitions. People are certainly saying that about Josh Stein. So it's going to be well watched and an interesting race.
Another one that is going to be very interesting to watch is the treasurer's race. We got another open seat there, Chris, and Dan Blue III, who has been a panelist on this show in times past, running against Republican Dale Falwell. What's your viewpoint on that?
I think this one's going to be very close too, Dale. I think they're both getting around the state quite a bit. Dan Blue benefits obviously from his father's being well known statewide, also a former NC Spin panelist, currently the Senate Minority Leader. Dale Falwell has strong support from the Republican Party, has run statewide before. I think this will be extremely
He's run for
close.
this office before.
And he's run for Lieutenant Governor. I think this will be extremely close.
I think what's interesting is these are two critically important races. They're both open seats, but the races are very different. The Attorney General's race is an ideological clash. Josh Stein, I think it is fair to say, is probably the most liberal candidate, not only nominated for Attorney General, but probably
maybe
any
on the ballot,
of the Council of State races from the Democratic side. Buck Newton's one of the most conservative candidates nominated for a Council of State race, so it's a stark ideological divide. Whereas in the state treasurer's race, it's really about competence, relevant experience. Some very technical issues have to do with the health plan and the pension fund, and two people who are very serious, detail-oriented people, as opposed to the ideological clash we're seeing in the Attorney General's race. Striking.
And again, the polls show these races
all pretty much
race,
statistically tied.
Yeah, pretty much tied. So again, we're going to expect a lot of money coming in here.
Maybe not so much for the treasurer's race as the Attorney General's race. I think we're likely to see a lot of outside money in the AG's race. I don't know any of the other down ballot races. We will maybe some independent expenditure within the state, but I don't think outside money.
Any other Council of State races that appear to be just compelling?
Well, I think the race for labor commissioner is interesting. Cherie Berry has been in office quite a while, has been popular in Republican circles, a former legislator, and this is a very serious challenge from former Raleigh Mayor Charles Meeker, who starts with a big urban base, is very popular in Raleigh. I think he starts with a base that a lot of other candidates against Berry haven't had.
We got to move on, and I want to get to some of the cases, the court races, because a lot of district court, superior court races come up. We've got 6 statewide appellate court elections. We saw millions of dollars, John, in 2012 poured into these statewide court seats. You see that happening this time?
There will be some significant spending in the state Supreme Court race. Bob Edmonds, the incumbent Republican, against the Democrat Mike Morgan, who's a Wake County District Court judge or Superior Court judge. And what I would say is this is, of course, a critical race to determine the balance on the Supreme Court. It will get attention and money.
The headliner, Andy, has got to be the Supreme Court race between Bob Edmonds and Michael Morgan.
Yeah, as John says, it will get a lot of money. It's control of the court. The interesting thing is, how do you break through, though, this year in these down ballot races, even for such important offices like Supreme Court and these Council of State races? If we're a battleground presidential state, we've got a very tight gubernatorial race. Looks like we might have a tight U.S. Senate race. It's going to be very difficult to be able to communicate with voters with all that background noise.
Another one of those races that is going to be interesting is a Court of Appeals race. Judge Martha Geer resigned her seat recently. We got a strange situation here. We got 3 candidates, Margaret Eagles, Donald Ray Blue, and Hunter Murphy, supposedly nonpartisan, but whoever gets the most votes is going to win that one. Any insights on it?
Well, we will see the partisan affiliation of the appellate court judges, and so it will undoubtedly be an example of whether or not it makes a difference to be a Democrat or a Republican running for statewide judicial seats. But I think generally voters don't know much about these candidates, don't hear much about the races. We may see some independent expenditure come into those races as well.
All right, we're going to cover the legislature when we come back after these messages.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
It's a fact. Patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely, building on North Carolina's medical home model. Better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at OurNCHealthcare.com.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
Okay. We continue our special edition NC Spin on the elections of 2016. We've got a lot of legislative races that are interesting. We've got 7 senators, 13 House members who said goodbye at the end of the short session. Some of them pretty significant. Senators Bob Rucho and Tom Ipataka, House members Skip Stan, Leo Daughtry. What impact is there going to have, and what turnover rate do we normally see?
Well, obviously those races will have different members, but most of those retirements are not in competitive districts, so that's not really the story. If you look back from 1952 to today, on average, the net partisan shift in the legislature every 2 years is about 11 seats. But most of the time it's single digits, and most of the time in this situation you would only expect a few seats to go Democrat or Republican.
All right,
that's
let's tee off, Joe. You follow these legislative races probably closer than anybody else in the state. Give us one you think is going to be a really hotly contested race.
Well, I think in the 1st Senate district, Bill Cook, the incumbent Republican there, in a district that's relatively speaking competitive on a partisan voter performance basis, a strong Democratic opponent there, but maybe that one is the one in the Senate that's competitive.
Andy, take a shot at competitive
Well, I think Wake County,
legislative.
there's 3 districts in the House and Senate in Wake County that will be really interesting as a sort of temperature gauge of where these suburban, demographically varied, high, fairly affluent districts are thinking about Republican leadership in the General Assembly.
Chris?
Well, I think the Charlotte and Raleigh areas are going to be the key. I think Tamara Behringer, state senator running against Susan Evans, is going to be an interesting race. I think Nelson Dollar's race against Jen Farrell will be closer than people think. She's raising a lot of money. The urban areas and the Democrats are going to make some gains. The question is, can the Republicans hold the suburbs?
John?
Another race I'll mention is in the Wilmington area, State Senate District 9. That's Michael Lee, a lawyer, a Republican, defending his seat against Andrew Barnhill, also a lawyer, the Democrat. It's a lean Republican district, but it's potentially competitive for the Democrats, and I think a fair amount of money will be spent on both sides in that race.
All right. Anybody else got some that got a half minute left?
Well, I'd also point out in the House there are a number of competitive races. One of them would be House District 8, which is Wilson and Pitt County. Susan Martin, who's the incumbent running against, I think, Charlie Ferris. She has had competitive races in the past and has prevailed. I think that's the most likely outcome, but it is one of the more competitive races in the House.
Anybody else real quick?
Paul Tyne, the only unaffiliated member of the State House now. There's not an unaffiliated candidate, so it definitely will change in its orientation this time to either Democrat or Republican.
All right. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this special edition of NC Spin, and thank Joe Stewart and Andy Taylor for providing us with their insights. Next week, we'll have another great program featuring our outstanding 4-H students in our state. And of course, you can get more balanced debate for the Old North State on our ncspin.com website or NC Spin on Facebook. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.